Full Contact Podcast, buckle up, you heard, like, follow, and share. Lycoming, you heard, we dare. Pulses of the Portland, why do people leave? Crank up the truth with Beth and Steve.
Welcome back to Lycoming, ya heard. I'm Steve Marshall.
And I'm Beth Fulmer.
Today, we're going to be diving into something that's probably on a lot of your minds here in Lycoming County. Concerns about the pre-release center.
The PRC.
The PRC, yeah. We've got this investigative article from FAFO Media, written by Mustin Hale, and it is packed with legal and ethical questions. We really encourage you to check it out after this deep dive and maybe even take some action. You can find the whole article linked in the description.
What I find so fascinating about this article is that it doesn't just focus on one incident. It connects several different issues. You know, you've got potential violations of the Americans with Disabilities Act, questionable practices around the work release program, and even some concerns about informed consent. It's really, really complex.
Yeah, and it's not just like abstract legal stuff. It's impacting real people's lives. You know, the article highlights the experiences of a disabled veteran, and it quotes other former inmates who allege some pretty serious problems. For instance, it dives deep into the situation at the Lycoming County landfill, claiming that inmates, particularly those receiving Social Security disability, are being pressured to work there.
And that raises a really important question. What is the true purpose of this work release program? Is it about rehabilitation? Is it about preparing these inmates for real-world jobs? Or is it more about using their labor for profit?
Yeah.
You know, one of the former inmates actually says that the county is more focused on the revenue generated from the vans they pack every morning than on corrections or adequately preparing inmates for reentry into society. The facility seems to prioritize financial gain over the well-being of inmates, thriving on a system that resembles torture while prioritizing the logistics of those vans.
Wow.
So that's a pretty powerful statement.
That's powerful. And, you know, it really highlights that conflict between the PRC's stated goals and then their practices. Like, what are they actually doing versus what they say they're doing?
Exactly.
The article actually goes so far as to cite specific laws, like the Americans with Disabilities Act,
The ADA,
and the Rehabilitation Act to back up these claims.
Right. And so for people who might not be super familiar with those, the ADA basically says you can't discriminate against someone for having a disability. And the Rehabilitation Act goes even further and says that, you know, if you're a federal agency, you have to provide accommodations for employees with disabilities. So if these allegations are true, it could mean that the PRC is violating both of these laws.
And it's not just about work suitability either. The article brings up COVID-19 vaccination as a requirement for work release. One former inmate claims that the PRC continued to use COVID-19 as a barrier to inmate employment well into 2023, even when the governor had abandoned all restrictions and mask mandates.
And this raises serious ethical questions about, you know, informed consent, right?
Right.
Was there any coercion going on here? Were inmates truly given a choice about getting vaccinated, or did they feel pressure because they might lose work opportunities?
Yeah.
The article even mentions that the PRC offered financial incentives to inmates who got vaccinated, which adds just another layer of complexity to this whole situation.
Yeah, it makes you wonder about the power dynamics at play and whether inmates felt like they could really make, you know, an informed decision. And speaking of potentially questionable practices, the article alleges that there were kangaroo courts inside the facility where inmates were denied due process.
Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with that term, a kangaroo court is essentially a mark court where they don't follow any of the established legal procedures. And this can lead to some very unfair judgments. And the 5th and 14th Amendments of the U.S. Constitution guarantee due process, meaning that you have the right to a fair trial. You have the right to defend yourself.
Right.
So if these allegations are true, it could mean that inmates were being disciplined or punished unfairly and arbitrarily without any real chance to defend themselves.
That's scary. According to the article, one former inmate even alleges that disciplinary actions were often based on the perceived value of an inmate as a laborer at the county landfill. It seems like the focus was on maximizing profit from inmate labor, rather than making sure that things were fair and just.
Yeah, and the article even cites Pennsylvania's rules governing inmate discipline, which really seem to be at odds with what this former inmate experienced. So you have to ask yourself, is the PRC truly fulfilling its intended purpose? You know, are they actually rehabilitating these inmates and preparing them to go back into society?
Well, according to the article, a retired Navy chief who was incarcerated there said that Robert Thompson, the PRC director, was fully aware and indifferent to inmate medical needs and the corrupt use of the work release system.
And he goes on to say that evidence has been declared undiscoverable by Lycoming's president, Judge Nancy Butts, at a public prison board meeting by scuttling it in human resources.
Wow.
These are some very serious accusations.
So it sounds like this retired Navy chief had a very different experience, than what you might expect from a rehabilitative program.
Absolutely. And he actually draws this contrast between his military background and what he observed at the PRC. He says, from law enforcement on the streets to the prison, the system resembles a circus full of clowns.
Oh, wow.
Really powerful visual there.
Yeah. And to highlight that contrast even further, the article mentions that he said that he followed his Navy Code of Conduct training even while he was at the PRC.
Wow.
So, he went in with this strong sense of ethics and accountability, which I think makes his criticisms even more potent.
Definitely, yeah. It adds a layer of credibility to his claims, for sure. It makes you wonder if this circus atmosphere is hindering the PRC's ability to actually rehabilitate.
Right, like maybe the focus is all on cheap labor, and it overshadows the need for, real support and guidance.
Right.
The article actually mentions the Pennsylvania Prison Society Act.
Oh, yeah.
And it outlines specific goals for rehabilitative facilities.
And one of those goals is to provide inmates with the tools and resources they need to re-enter society successfully.
Right.
So if the PRC is prioritizing work at the landfill over, other programs, then are they really complying with this act?
It seems like there are a lot of potential legal issues at play here. We've got possible violations of the ADA, the Rehabilitation Act, concerns about due process, and now this question about compliance with the Pennsylvania Prison Society Act. It's very complex.
It's a lot. And I think it's important to remember that these aren't just abstract legal concepts. This is real life. These have real-world consequences for the inmates, and for the community as a whole.
You mentioned that this situation impacts us all. Can you talk about that a little bit more? What are those broader implications?
Well, think of it this way. The PRC is part of our local justice system.
Okay.
Right? And how that system operates, it really reflects on our community.
Yeah.
What are our values? What are our priorities? If we're tolerating a system that potentially exploits vulnerable individuals, what does that say about us?
Yeah, that's a good point. It raises the question of what we can do to ensure that our justice system's actually fair and just, and it focuses on rehabilitation, not just punishment.
Exactly. And this article is really calling all of us to action. Pay attention to what's happening, hold our elected officials accountable, make sure the PRC is operating in a way that aligns with our values.
And the article ends with a quote from the Navy chief that really drives this point home. He says, the Lycoming County commissioners have a lot more problems than the reported waning finances of the Lycoming County landfill. Unchecked abuse with deliberate indifference deserves accountability in return.
He's not holding back.
No.
He's not mincing words. He clearly feels that there needs to be some accountability for what he sees as abuse within the system. And to add another layer of complexity to this whole situation, he ends with a question. Now imagine 42% of the prison population on psychotropic medications and how that system exploits the mentally ill.
Oh, wow. That's a lot. And it makes you think about a population that might be vulnerable because of mental health conditions. Like, what could potentially happen there? What could go wrong? Right.
The article doesn't really dive deep into this aspect, but it's something to think about. How are these medications being prescribed? Are inmates being monitored? What are the side effects? How does being on these medications affect their ability to participate in work release programs?
Yeah. It sounds like we need another whole deep dive just to unpack that one question. But before we get too sidetracked, let's bring it back to the allegations against the PRC and the potential impact on the community.
Yeah, let's refocus. And it's important to remember that these are real people. This is not just some abstract debate. These are people whose lives are being affected. And that human element should not be forgotten.
It's easy to get lost in the details. But at the end of the day, these are real people whose lives are being impacted by this.
Right, and it's important to remember, too, that we're only hearing one side of the story here. We're not hearing from the PRC administration. We're not hearing from the county commissioners. We're not hearing from inmates who maybe had a positive experience.
That's a really good point. There might be more to this.
Exactly.
But, even so, these are some serious allegations, and they deserve, more investigation, more discussion.
For sure. This article is really a starting point for a larger conversation. It's a call for transparency. A call for accountability.
So what does all this mean for, us, people living here in Lycoming County? We've been talking about potential legal violations, ethical concerns. It's a lot.
Right. It can feel overwhelming. But I think the important thing to remember is awareness is the first step towards change. So, what stands out to you as the most pressing issue?
Yeah, for me, it's the question of, is the PRC actually doing what it's supposed to be doing? Like, is it rehabilitating people? Or is it just focused on making money?
I think that's a great point, and that kind of gets to this bigger question of, how do we view incarceration? Is it about punishment or is it about rehabilitation?
And, let's not forget about the landfill itself. I mean, we've heard that Lycoming County is working on an article about possible OSHA violations there.
Oh, wow.
So that adds a whole other layer of concern to this.
Definitely. If inmates are being forced to work in unsafe conditions, what does that say about the PRC's priorities?
It seems like we've just, scratched the surface here, but I think the takeaway is this. This is a conversation we need to be having. We need to ask questions. We need to hold our elected officials accountable.
Absolutely. And, we've been talking about this article from FAFO Media. You can find a link to it in the episode description. We encourage you to read it for yourself, form your own opinions, and, maybe even take some action. Write to your representatives, attend a prison board meeting, just talk to your friends and neighbors. It's time for us to all get involved.
Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive. And, we hope that this episode sparked some critical thinking about this really important issue.
Sure has no snooky, that's the word. And Missy Lane's sugar cookies slap, you heard. Like, follow and share. Lycoming, you heard, we dare. Pulses up the port, and why do people leave? Crank up the truth with Beth and Steve.